Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patrick Flynn. I'm the Senior Consultant with the Testing and Education Solutions Department with Castle Worldwide and Tailwind Placement Exams. And we certainly appreciate your time and your interest in Tailwind. And thank you for attending this particular webinar session, 5 things you need to know about placement testing accommodations. Today we have Tim O'Connor presenting the webinar. Many of you out there know Tim. Tim is the Distinguished Administrative Program Specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, working with the Center for Placement Testing. It's his job to coordinate the various services that the center offers with other UW system campuses. And of course, he also works at recommending special accommodations for placement testing due to disabilities for the UW system campuses. If you had the opportunity to attend the NCTA conference in Seattle last week, you undoubtedly had a chance to see Tim in action and attended his discussions and presentations, and we're very pleased to have him here today. I'm going to change and make sure that Tim is our presenter. And Tim, I have turned over all of that to you. It is.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Tim, I made you the presenter, and I'm guessing I'm looking at your screen.
Yeah, and all right, is that showing up now?
I see it, yes, sir.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, Patrick. We'll get everything going now. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about placement testing accommodations, and I picked out the 5 things that kind of all fit together. And if any of you were at some of the things I've talked about in the past, like in Seattle, you'll know that what I'm going to talk about today is very important to me because I sit on both sides of this. My background is in disabilities, learning disabilities specifically, and as well as I've been in the testing profession doing this for over 26 years now. So a lot of what I say here isn't often well known, and that's why I'd like to get this information out. First thing I'd like you to know, accommodations are an attempt to level the playing field. I'm sure you've all heard that phrase used before, leveling the playing field. But what does that really mean? Well, for someone in testing, it means your tests have to be accessible to be valid measurements. If someone can't access that test, if it's not accessible to them, you're not going to get any kind of a measurement that's meaningful whatsoever. Accommodations, what we do here, what we're talking about, are an attempt to filter out the disabling factors that interfere with accessibility. So, whoops, excuse me, I went one too far, but I just need to talk about a couple of things here. Research shows that all students do better on tests if given more time or if given oral presentations of the material. But it is important that it's accessible to the students that we grant these special things to, such as visual impairments can be filtered out through magnification or screen reading. Hearing impairments can be filtered out through sign language interpreters. Learning disabilities through extra time for processing. On our placement tests, the majority of the students approved and receiving extended time do not need or even use that extra time. This is what we kind of refer to as a security blanket. These students are so used to getting this extra time in everything they do that oftentimes they don't need it. The thing about our placement tests is that it's very different than the ACT, where something the ACT or the SAT, where they load as many questions as they can, and you're really not expected to complete it, or at least most students aren't expected to complete sections. That's not true of the placement tests. We offer plenty of time for students to get done what we have on there, the items that we have on there. So that is not an issue. And we figure, what I'm looking at through the years, about 90% of the students who receive extended time for whatever disability actually get finished in the normal amount of standardized time. So reasonable accommodations must be reasonable, point 2. Test scores must accurately reflect the individual's aptitude, achievement level, or whatever the skill the test is intended to measure. Placement tests, what our placement tests are there for, we're trying to measure individual skill development so that we can place them into the proper course. That's what it is we're trying to do with this test. Modifications may not be a reasonable accommodation. Modifications are where you are actually changing something specific about the construct of the test. Now, oftentimes that's used in things where you're just trying to test knowledge because you want to test what a student knows. But that's not what we're testing here. So generally speaking, when it comes to placement tests, what we are looking for is a specific construct that we're measuring. In the case of English, what we're trying to do is measure basically the written language skills of the students. So we have found that some things like if you want to test calculation abilities of a student in math, if what you're testing is calculations, you don't want to give them a calculator to test that. If what you're testing is reading comprehension, you certainly don't want to read it to the student. You don't do an oral presentation, okay? Because then you're not measuring what you are really attempting to measure. So your test becomes invalid at that point. We found that visually impaired students using Braille math tests seem to have scores that are not truly indicative of their skill level. So this is another one where you have to look at, math is very, very much a visual medium. What we found, and we do offer with our paper pencil testing, we do offer Braille versions because oftentimes that's the only way you can test. But as I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, I believe there are other ways you can find that information. And I do not believe that Braille math tests, at least for most students, measure their true skills. I think it underreports their abilities in math. Test validity is important. And obviously this is true. Anyone in testing would know this. But the one thing we want to talk about, and you've heard me mention it a few times already, is construct validity. That is the degree to which a test measures what it is meant to measure. You have certain constructs. That's what's being measured with a test. That's what the test is meant to do. And if construct validity were not important, then it really wouldn't matter what test we gave an individual. In other words, if we could use a social studies test to be given to measure aptitude in science. It's a test, right? The constructs are not the same. You have to have the correct construct. What you want to measure, it's very, very important. And tests are created to measure very specific information. Oral presentations, in my mind, compromise the construct validity of the English placement test when it's used to place students into composition or writing courses, which is what our English placement test is generally used to do. At least that's what we use it for. There is no significant correlation between listening comprehension skills, which is what you get when you read the test to someone, and written language skills, while there is a very strong correlation between reading comprehension skills and written language skills. So in other words, if you give an oral presentation of that test, you're getting a measure that doesn't mean anything to you. It's not what you're trying to measure. It's not the correct construct. The concept of construct validity is why so many education professionals do not approve of using test scores for determining merit or other job-related evaluations. This is one of the things we've heard about a lot in recent years when we're talking about accountability. And there's a reason why you don't want to use that. There are a lot of factors in that test that are not being measured. And those kinds of things, using them for the wrong purpose, it's not what tests are for, and that's not what you want to do. So the fourth point on here is to test or not to test. And I had sort of alluded to this before with the Braille exam. Placement into the proper course or level of course is the goal of placement testing. It isn't taking the test, it's getting placement. That's what we want. So how do we do that? There are times when providing a test accommodation that are not reasonable is not the best measurement answer. It is possible that you can actually gain information without testing an individual. And I often don't do this myself much anymore, but I do many times recommend that we have the faculty in the discipline being that wants to be tested, whether it's math, whether it's English, whether it's foreign language, to have them actually do this themselves. They can talk to the student. They can contact the student's teachers if these students are just coming out of high school, which is the vast majority of our students. That's what we see. And there's a lot more information on students who are in special education than there are students in the mainstream. There's a lot more data, a lot more specific information about their skills. Oftentimes within the last 3 years, they will have had very specific diagnostic tests given to them. So you have very specific information already about them that gives you just as much as what you would get, maybe even more than what you would get out of the placement test itself. So you don't have to, the goal here is not to test someone. The goal here is to get the proper placement of the students. So the last point I want to make here is using common sense. And as those of you who have ever been to my presentations in the past, you know I like to use quotes. And this is one I really like. It's common sense is the knack of seeing things as they are and doing things as they ought to be done. And that's kind of what we want here with the placement test. Oftentimes, awareness is the thing that promotes understanding. We have to use our heads and think about our goal here, which is placement. It's not the test. So there are a lot of things you have to look at, a lot of factors you have to take into account. And very oftentimes, I'm going to tell you from my own experience in this, and I've been doing this a long time, a lot of times people don't understand that. Parents often don't understand it. Oftentimes, teachers that you deal with from the high schools don't understand it. One of the times in my early years here, one of the administrators at another UW college who was in charge, he was the ADA coordinator at that campus, did not understand this concept. However, once I created an awareness within him, and as I've done with many, many other people through the years, so that they understand this concept of construct validity, and the test validity has a great deal of importance as well as the accommodations for the disability. Once they understand that, then, oh, okay, that makes sense now. So you just have to kind of create that understanding. And at this point, I've gone through the points I wanted to make, and I can open this up for any questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, this is Patrick Flynn with Tailwind Placement Exams. If you have any questions, please type them in to the question box that you'll see there in your navigation. We have had a couple of questions come in while Tim was going through his presentation. So Tim, if you would, first of all, can allowing students too much time on the placement exams be an issue? And if so, how?
Yes, it absolutely can, especially with certain types of students when they oftentimes get extended time. Students with ADHD, for example, oftentimes students with learning disabilities. The problem is one of their major problems is understanding the concept of time and organizing themselves. And if you create an artificial no boundary at all, then they oftentimes won't self-organize. And oftentimes you need that time limit there, and sometimes they do need to be reminded of it a few times to control themselves and take care of the fact that they do need to continue moving. What happens oftentimes is if you allow too much time, they will get lost and they will do very, very poorly on the test. They may finish, but they will not have really been focused on the test. So it is important. I would say that there is probably never an indication of that you should give unlimited time to a student taking our placement test. They would get a very poor placement. It would not be indicative of how good they could be.
Very good. Another question. Should we discuss the importance of test validity with our Disability Services Office?
Absolutely, and that gets back to that last point I was making about creating an awareness so you get a better understanding. I've spent a lot of time over the years discussing this issue with the Disability Services Offices because they tend to look at things from a student advocacy point of view, which basically is what they're supposed to be doing for the most part. But they don't take into consideration all the stuff we've talked about, that there are certain things about a test that you also have to take into consideration. you have to kind of blend this all together with the disability so that you come up with what we would consider a reasonable accommodation. And usually when you talk about it, like I said, in the people I've talked about in the past, if you explain the situation and explain how construct validity works in testing, they usually understand and say, oh, yeah, especially if you use the term reasonable and appropriate when you're talking about the accommodations.
Very good. Another question. Can you please give some examples of resources for students who are visually impaired as it relates to placement testing in math?
That is a tough one, because you're going to have to look at how they learned through the years there. It's math is a very tricky thing, especially when you get to higher levels. When you're just talking about main algebraic equations and things of that nature, you can reiterate those verbally, and the student can understand it at that point. However, when you get into the higher ones, where you're talking, graphs and very visual things, it becomes much more difficult for them to truly understand. A lot of it, though, does depend on their background in math and how they were taught. There is a project, I do not off the top of my head have the URL for it, but it's a project I worked on several years ago with people at UW-Milwaukee called Access Ed. It was a federal Department of Education demonstration grant that we did, and we created just one of the greatest websites you can possibly find for universal design concepts. And that's kind of what you're getting at here, is you want to try to use universal design concepts as much as possible for students with visual disabilities. And that's not just the students themselves, but also the faculty. Anyone that is doing any instructing of those students, they need to understand how they do it, because it is a bit different. And this website, and all you have to do is, if you do a search under Access-ED, it will come up with the website, and you look at it, and it's just an amazing resource for anyone. Also, I'm sure the Universal Access and Testing, SIG, we will continue to create resources, and that is certainly a very good one, where we could maybe spend some time trying to find specific resources for students with visual disabilities.
And kind of an add-on to that one, are the resources different for dyslexics and or dysgraphics versus a student who is blind either totally or legally?
They're going to be somewhat different, because the nature of the disability is different. You don't see a lot of people, well, the dysgraphia, yes, somewhat. That's not as prevalent. When it comes to dyslexia, I come from a certain point of view that dyslexia is a completely curable problem, and it all depends on how things are done when they're teaching someone to read. And the research shows, unbelievably, without a doubt, that a heavy phonics-based, coordinated, systematic educational program can basically, for the most part, cure dyslexia. And it's unfortunate that we have so much of other programs out there, and people in the schools don't use the correct programs, where they all, I'm a former LD teacher, and this is one of the things that I oftentimes criticize my colleagues for, is that they treat the symptom, they do not treat the disease. Taping everything and presenting oral presentations for people with dyslexia, you're just treating a symptom. You can actually fix what the problem is, and you can get them so that they can read right along with anyone else, and that includes adults. There are programs, we have some incredible programs right here in Madison, where we work with adults in teaching them who have dyslexia or other learning disabilities and have basically a reading issue, where they are taught to read by going back to the basics of phonemic segmentation, where you teach them this. Now, getting back to the original point of the question is, the resources are going to be somewhat different, because the nature of the disability is somewhat different. Dyslexia, while it seems like it's a visual issue, is really not. It's really an issue of understanding the language itself.
Very good. Any other questions out there from our audience? Just had one come in. Given that placement testing is happening prior to actual matriculation, should documentation be required prior to allowing a student to take a placement test with non-standard accommodations?
Yes, it should. And that is how we do it here. The students are admitted, but obviously they're not on campus. And the vast majority of students will take their placement test before they come to campus, oftentimes many months before they come to campus. Excuse me. So what we do is I'm the one who actually looks at the documentation, but I don't ask for full documentation. Oftentimes I get it, but that isn't what I ask. What I want to know is a little bit about their previous, what they've gotten for test accommodations in the past, and I also want to have a contact person from their high school that I can talk to. So I just basically ask them for a letter from someone at the high school on high school letterhead who's familiar with their disability and what their accommodations have been. And usually that's a guidance counselor, but oftentimes it'll be a special ed teacher. Sometimes it will be a principal. It can be just about anyone who's familiar. And it tells me what the student's accommodations have been in the past, and then if I have any questions or if I want to get more information about the nature of the disability, because we certainly do get a wide range of disabilities, and how the accommodations have to be presented can be different even if you consider the disability the same. It gives me someone that I can contact. So that's how we do it here. It's kind of an external process to what the campuses do, because I do this for all 26 campuses in the UW system. But again, I've been doing it for 26 years and it's worked very, very well.
Very good. We had a question submitted about unproctored placement versus proctoring, and the person that asked understands now that it's going to be a separate webinar, but I'm curious, Tim, what do you think about proctored versus unproctored for students with learning disabilities or those that need accommodations?
When it comes to accommodations, I see no difference between whether you're receiving an accommodation or whether you're not, whether you're in a standardized environment. I believe that, especially the way we use our placement tests, they have to be proctored. It's just part and parcel of where you go. Now, it doesn't mean that one group is more apt to cheat than another, but it's the kind of the old preventative thing. If you see it there, you're not so apt to try to do something wrong. Now, oftentimes, it depends on how you use the placement test. We do use our placement tests here at Madison, at UW-Madison. We use it to satisfy general education requirements. So the students actually do gain quite a bit if they were to do better. It would probably hurt them in the long run because they would misplace themselves. But to us, that's really important. And I just believe that in this kind of a situation, and just as much with accommodations as without, you do need to have this done in a proctored environment.
Very good. Any other questions out there? I don't see anything additional in the questions box on my screen. Certainly, as you can see the slide up there currently, the webinar series will continue with retesting on August 24 and the other topics there before you. We will be sending out invitations with registration links to all of these as we continue throughout the series. Certainly, if any of you have suggestions or ideas for webinars that you'd like to see, then please, by all means, send them to me. That's pflynn@castleworldwide.com, or you can send them to Tim or Jim Wallach. Anybody out there who's working with Tailwind placement exams will be glad to help you with that, and we certainly would like your input. If there are no additional questions, we certainly want to respect your time. These are meant to be quick hitting and informative type webinars, and I think we certainly have accomplished that today. I want to thank Tim O'Connor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison for imparting his knowledge, and we appreciate all of your interest and attention in today's series. Thanks very much for being here. Again, if you have any questions, if you'd like to visit our website, it's tailwindtesting.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we look forward to having you in future webinars. Thanks very much.